Carter had spent the majority of his life chasing after success. From an early age, he was taught that the key to happiness and fulfillment was in achievement. High school honor roll, college with honors, the perfect job, a beautiful wife. David had it all. Or at least, he thought he did. For the last 10 years, David had worked at a prestigious marketing firm. He was well known for his work ethic, his attention to detail, and his ability to close deals. His colleagues admired him, and his boss was always impressed by his results. But the more David achieved, the more he sacrificed. His marriage to Emma was strained. He barely saw his children, Luke and Sophia, who were growing up without a real connection to their father. Every moment was consumed by the pressure to succeed, to climb higher, to prove himself. Then, everything came crashing down. The company David worked for faced an unexpected financial crisis, and within the span of a week, he was let go. He was told that his position was no longer necessary, that he was surplus in a company that had been running on fumes for months. It wasn't just a job he lost, it was his sense of identity. He sat in his empty office, staring at the walls, the silence deafening. The accolades he had accumulated over the years suddenly felt hollow. The career he had worked so hard to build felt meaningless. He wasn't just a man without a job, he was a man without a purpose. At home, things were no better. Emma, his wife, was distant. She had been patient with his long hours, his constant distractions, and his obsession with work, but now she too seemed to be running on empty. They had grown apart, and after a long conversation one evening, Emma told him she wanted a divorce. The love they once shared had withered under the weight of unmet expectations and unspoken resentment. She was done. And just like that, David lost his family. He found himself alone in an empty apartment, drowning in his thoughts. The man who once had it all was now a failure. He had no job, no marriage, and no sense of self-worth. Every day felt like an insurmountable weight. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, and he couldn't bring himself to face anyone. It had been months since David lost everything, and he was still adrift. His savings were running low, and he hadn't even started looking for another job. He was paralyzed by fear, depression, and shame. One morning, feeling completely drained, he decided to take a walk through the city. Maybe the fresh air would clear his mind, though he wasn't sure if he even had the energy for that. He ended up at a local park, where an older man was sitting on a bench, reading a book. David didn't know why, but something about the man's calm presence drew him in. The old man looked up as David passed by, his gaze steady, but warm. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," the old man said gently without judgment. David paused. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. "I guess you could say that," he replied, his voice flat. He was tired of pretending everything was fine. The old man smiled and patted the bench beside him. "Sit for a while. Sometimes a fresh perspective can make a world of difference." David hesitated, but found himself sitting next to the man. His name was Charles, and he was retired, had been for many years. He was a former professor who had spent his life teaching literature and philosophy. His life wasn't glamorous, but he seemed content. For the next hour, Charles spoke to David not about solutions or success, but about life, about how everything in life is temporary, including our successes and failures. "We spend so much time trying to avoid pain, trying to protect ourselves from suffering," Charles said. "But it's in that very suffering that we find the greatest growth. Without it, we would never change." David listened, but part of him was skeptical. How could suffering bring growth? All it had done for him was tear his life apart. But Charles wasn't offering platitudes. He was speaking from experience, from a place of true understanding. Charles continued, "You see, David, you've been living your life for the wrong reasons. You've been chasing after the illusion of success, climbing a ladder that was never meant for you. The moment you realize that failure is just a part of the process, you can begin to rebuild. It's in the ashes of your life that you'll find your real self." David didn't know it then, but this conversation was the beginning of his rebirth. Over the next few weeks, he met with Charles regularly. Their talks were long, philosophical, and often deeply uncomfortable. But they forced David to confront his demons, his fears, and the stories he had been telling himself about who he was. Charles encouraged David to start small. "Take care of yourself first," he said. You can't rebuild what's inside if you're falling apart on the outside. David started going for daily walks, something he hadn't done in years. Slowly, he began to feel stronger physically. He started to reconnect with his body and mind, something he had ignored for so long. He ate better, slept more, and began journaling about his feelings, something he had never done before. Charles also encouraged David to reconnect with his passions. What did you love to do before the world told you what success should look like? Charles asked. David thought long and hard. As a young man, he had loved writing, poetry, short stories, but somewhere along the way, he had abandoned it for the corporate grind. Charles encouraged him to start writing again, to rediscover the joy of creativity without worrying about what others thought. David took a deep breath, bought a notebook, and began writing. Days turned into weeks, and something inside David began to shift. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't chasing after anything. He wasn't seeking approval or validation. He was simply being. He started writing regularly, exploring his feelings, and allowing himself to heal. The more he wrote, the more he understood himself. One afternoon, after months of soul-searching, David sat with Charles in the park again. He had lost weight, his energy was restored, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. I think I'm finally starting to understand, David said. Charles smiled. What have you learned? David took a deep breath. I've learned that I'm not my job, not my marriage, not my failures. I'm more than those things. I've learned that I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I just need to be myself. Charles nodded. And that, David, is the beginning of your rebirth. You are like the phoenix. You have risen from the ashes of your old life, stronger and wiser than before. You're ready to live the life you were always meant to live. A few months later, David stood in front of a small crowd at a local bookstore, reading an excerpt from one of his short stories. He had published a collection of personal essays and stories, sharing his journey of transformation. His writing had resonated with people who were going through their own struggles, and David realized that this was his true calling, helping others find the courage to rise from their own ashes. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't pretending to. But what David had learned was that the journey was not about reaching some ultimate destination of success. It was about living authentically, embracing every part of who you are, including your struggles and your failures. David had finally embraced the phoenix within him. He had learned that true strength came not from perfection, but from the ability to rise again, time and time again, no matter how many times life knocked him down. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. And remember, success is only meaningful when shared with those who matter most.